October 1981, deep inside Syria, an Israeli jet squadron bombs a nuclear reactor secretly funded by Iran's biggest enemy. But this introduction strike was just a spark. For decades, Israel and Iran were destined to collide, and not even world powers could stop it. Why? Because what fuels this rivalry goes far beyond politics or religion. It's rooted in ancient fears, betrayals, and a race for survival. Today, we'll break down why this conflict was always unstoppable, and how it could shape the next global crisis. Long before the world worried about nuclear deals or counted missiles on satellite images, this conflict was already alive, etched not in war rooms, but in ancient scrolls whispered through centuries. Most people look at Israel and Iran and see a modern power struggle, a geopolitical nightmare that politicians promise to solve but never do. What if I told you they can't solve it? Not because they're incompetent, but because they're irrelevant to the real story unfolding behind closed doors. This war didn't start with uranium or secret labs. It began with a promise and a betrayal, with two brothers standing under desert stars, one chosen to carry a covenant, the other destined to watch from the edges. And somewhere between that starlit promise and today's headlines, the tension hardened into a hostility no treaty could dissolve. You may think you understand why Israel and Iran stand poised at the brink of war, but there's a layer deeper, one most news anchors will never dare touch. Because hidden beneath policy speeches and security summits lies something older than any border map, a storyline where the players were named before they were born. Stay with me, because before this is over, I'll show you how what's coming was written long before the missiles ever existed. But first, you need to see how two brothers drew the first battle line. To grasp why no ceasefire will ever bury this conflict, you have to stand beside an old man named Abraham. He wasn't a general or a king, just a wanderer who heard a promise under the night sky. God told him his descendants would outnumber the stars, inherit a land, and carry a covenant no empire could erase. But desire and impatience twisted that promise before it ever took root. Abraham fathered two sons. Isaac, the child born of divine timing, carried the covenant. Ishmael, born of human timing and desperation, carried something else. A blessing, yes, but from a distance. Genesis records it plainly. God said Ishmael would become a great nation too, but the promise of the land, the covenant bond, would pass through Isaac. Two boys grew into two bloodlines. Isaac's line became Israel. Ishmael's, the root of many Arab tribes whose legacy echoes through today's Islamic nations. But there's another thread, one most skip in Sunday school. Not all enemies of Israel trace back to Ishmael alone. There's Japheth's line too, Noah's eldest son. From Japheth came Madai, the ancestor of the Medes, who fused with the Persians to build an empire that would stand taller than Babylon ever dreamed. Persia, today's Iran, wasn't just another neighbor. It was the iron in the furnace that tested Israel's survival again and again. So when you hear politicians debate sanctions and peace talks, remember this. The roots are older than governments. Two brothers, two lines, one covenant embraced, and one blessed but restless, and both bound to collide where prophecy says they must. But the most astonishing twist is what Persia did next, and how it once stood not as Israel's enemy, but its unexpected deliverer. We'll return to that. History rarely gives its greatest plot twists to kings who pray, but Persia was different. It rose from the rugged highlands east of Babylon, and, under one man, did what no other empire had dared. It freed Israel instead of crushing it further. Cyrus the Great, a pagan by birth and conqueror by trade, appears in the Bible not as an oppressor, but as a shepherd, God's anointed instrument, named over a century before he drew breath. Isaiah 45 calls him just that, the Lord's chosen to break Babylon's chains and open Jerusalem's gates. Imagine that. A foreign throne, an uncircumcised king, yet his decree rebuilt the very temple that Nebuchadnezzar's fires had turned to ash. Ezra records his words, "The Lord, the God of heaven, has given me all the kingdoms of the earth, and has appointed me to build a temple for him at Jerusalem." This wasn't Israel's might, it was Persia's unexpected mercy, or more precisely, God's sovereignty, using a pagan empire to keep his word alive. But empires don't stay loyal forever. The same Persia that restored the covenant city would later nurture threats hidden behind palace walls. Within its golden courts, a dark plan once formed that almost erased the Jewish people overnight. That story belongs to a young queen whose courage broke the cycle. But before we reach her, ask yourself, how does a nation shift from liberator to sworn enemy? There's a clue buried in that royal conspiracy, and it still whispers in Iran's halls today. We'll come back to it. Deep inside Persia's marble palaces, long after Cyrus's decree rebuilt Jerusalem's hope, another story took shape, one that almost wiped that hope out entirely. King Xerxes I, known in the Bible as Ahasuerus, ruled an empire stretching from India to Ethiopia. Power dripped from every golden column in his court, but so did danger hidden behind silken curtains and whispered conspiracies. In that same court, unseen by foreign diplomats, a Jewish orphan named Esther rose to a throne she never asked for. Her beauty crowned her queen, but her silence nearly signed her people's death warrant. Haman, a trusted advisor consumed by hate, convinced the king to sign an irreversible edict. On a chosen day, every Jew in the empire could be hunted and killed. It was legal. It was final. It should have ended the covenant in one generation. But Persia's paradox emerged again. The same kingdom that freed Israel from Babylon now hosted the plot to erase it completely. And once more, God's plan unfolded where no one expected. Esther risked her life, stepping uninvited before the king, a crime punishable by death. She exposed Haman's scheme, turned royal favor, and secured a counter-decree that gave her people a fighting chance. This wasn't just survival. It was proof that even within an empire's betrayal, divine preservation works quietly. Persia sheltered both deliverance and destruction, often in the same breath. That duality never truly vanished. It hardened, evolved, and centuries later, when Persia changed its name to Iran, that hidden threat would roar back louder than Esther's generation could have imagined. But to see how it returned, you need to watch what happened in 1979. When history textbooks skim over Persia's final act, they rarely dwell on what came next. The mighty empire that once sheltered a young queen's courage didn't vanish overnight. It fragmented under Greek, Arab, and Mongol hands until its ancient crown seemed just a memory buried beneath new dynasties. But Persia never really died. It waited for a moment to resurrect itself under a new banner. That moment arrived in 1979. Before 1979, Iran, still called Persia by poets, was a monarchy clinging to Western ties, oil contracts, and fragile alliances with America and Europe. Streets of Tehran flickered with foreign films, nightclubs, and a hint of modernity. But beneath the suits and skyscrapers, something older pulsed. The conviction that faith, not politics, should define a nation's soul. When Ayatollah Khomeini ignited that fire, The Shah fell like dry timber, and overnight Iran shed its polished image to reveal something raw, revolutionary, and deeply religious. This was not just a political coup, it was a spiritual pivot. The Islamic Republic did more than rewrite Iran's constitution. It resurrected an ancient hostility dressed in modern uniforms. For the new clerical regime, Israel wasn't a neighbor to tolerate. It was a theological insult, a trespasser in land Islam once ruled. Iran's leaders didn't simply criticize Israel's policies, they denied its right to exist, funded proxies to surround it, and declared a mission to liberate Jerusalem by force if necessary. But there's an unsettling layer under all this rhetoric. Many dismiss Iran's threats as politics for the cameras. But what if the cameras capture only half the truth? Behind the nuclear headlines and proxy militias lurks an echo of Persia's ancient spirit. Once anointed to protect Israel, now sworn to erase it. And long before this new regime chanted death to Zion, a prophet named Ezekiel saw Persia's name etched beside others in a vision of a final war. That's where this turns from headline to prophecy. Let's pull back that curtain next. Centuries before Iran's nuclear ambitions rattled world powers, a prophet named Ezekiel sat by a river in Babylon, exiled but far from silent. He wrote a vision so strange that scholars still debate every line. Yet, in Ezekiel 38, his words cut through confusion with unsettling clarity. In the last days, a coalition of nations would rise to invade Israel. And Persia, yes, Persia, would stand at the center of that alliance. Ezekiel lists the names plainly: Persia, Cush, Put, Gomer, and the mysterious leader called Gog, of the land of Magog. Many link Gog's territory to lands north of Israel, possibly parts of modern Russia or Central Asia. What matters more is the coalition's aim, not economic gain, not territorial squabbles, but a final attempt to crush a people who carry an unbreakable promise. In Ezekiel's vision, these armies gather with arrogance, seeing Israel as an undefended land, an easy conquest. But they forget the covenant they're really challenging. Look around today. Iran funnels billions to Hezbollah in Lebanon, props up militias in Syria and Iraq, arms groups in Gaza. Each front surrounds Israel like tightening threads in a prophecy few take seriously. Critics say it's just politics, power games for oil pipelines and regional influence. But Ezekiel didn't mention oil or trade routes. He described a spiritual collision, nations drawn like iron to a magnet for a war they think they choose, but that prophecy long ago assigned them. But here's what even many believers miss. Ezekiel's chapter doesn't end with Israel's defeat. It ends with God's fury. Plagues, hail, fire, and a storm that shatters the pride of armies and proves, once more, who owns the last word in the Middle East. Iran may chant and build weapons, but their fate was sealed before the first missile left a silo. The deeper layer? There's an invisible war pushing these alliances into place, and that part is older than Ezekiel himself. We'll uncover it next. Most people stop at maps and missiles. They measure threats by troop counts and nuclear stockpiles, forgetting that Scripture insists the real battle has never been flesh against flesh. Daniel, a contemporary of Ezekiel, once fasted for 3 weeks, desperate for an answer from God. When an angel finally reached him, he revealed something staggering. He had been delayed, not by human soldiers, but by a supernatural force, the Prince of Persia. This was no royal heir, but a spiritual ruler, a demonic authority operating behind Persia's empire, influencing kings, decrees, and the fate of Israel without ever stepping onto a battlefield. Paul echoes this centuries later in his letter to the Ephesians. Our struggle is not against flesh and blood, but against rulers, against the powers of this dark world, against the spiritual forces of evil in the heavenly realms. Fast forward to today's Iran. Analysts dissect military alliances, economic sanctions, and uranium enrichment programs. But few dare ask, what power still whispers behind Tehran's slogans? If there was a prince of Persia, then who whispers to Iran's leaders now? This hatred for Israel is more than national pride. It's a centuries-old spiritual war waged to erase a testimony of God's faithfulness that no regime has ever succeeded in silencing. This explains why every missile aimed at Israel is more than metal and explosives. It's a declaration against a covenant that hell itself cannot rewrite. But the darkness has a fatal flaw. Every plot to curse what God has blessed backfires, and the final blow won't come from a policy summit or a peace accord, but from a mountain east of Jerusalem, where the unseen becomes undeniable. That's where we go next. For centuries, armies have fought for Jerusalem's stones. Romans, Crusaders, Ottomans, each convinced that owning this patch of rock would crown them unstoppable. Yet none held it forever, and none understood that the true fight was never for walls or gates, but for what Jerusalem embodies, the heart of a covenant too stubborn to die. Zechariah, another prophet standing in Babylon's shadow, foresaw a moment no army can prepare for. He wrote that one day, the Mount of Olives, east of Jerusalem's old city, will split in two at the very feet of a returning king. This isn't poetry. It's geography wrapped in divine resolve. The same hill where Jesus ascended will witness his return, this time not as a teacher, but as a warrior who ends wars. Iran's clerics chant about liberating Jerusalem. Hezbollah, funded by Tehran, digs tunnels and stockpiles rockets to strike Israel's heart. Yet in all their calculations, they overlook what Zechariah declared. No coalition can seize what God has staked his name upon. 2 Chronicles 6:6 makes it plain. I have chosen Jerusalem for my name to be there. This isn't a political claim. It's a divine boundary line no missile can redraw. But here's the tension most miss. Jerusalem is more than Israel's capital. It is the fuse waiting for a spark. Ezekiel's vision, Daniel's angelic warfare, Zechariah's mountain, each piece points here. The closer Iran's proxies press to Jerusalem's walls, the closer the world inches toward a final collision that isn't about oil or borders, but about the throne behind it all. And while soldiers drill and drones circle the skies, something else stirs underground and in hearts worldwide. A reminder that when this city ignites, it won't just test armies. It will reveal who truly rules nations and writes the last line of history. But there's still one more truth this conflict exposes, one that drags it from headlines to your doorstep. Stay with me. Scroll through any news feed today, and you'll see headlines predicting Israel's downfall. Analysts argue over Iran's enrichment levels, missile ranges, secret bunkers hidden under Tehran's streets. It all feels so urgent, so final, until you remember Psalm 2. Why do the nations rage and the peoples plot in vain? The one enthroned in heaven laughs. That laughter isn't mockery, it's certainty. Every plan to erase Israel must crash against a promise older than Persia, older than Islam, older than every flag flapping on embassies tonight. This is why no war room in Tehran, no proxy force on Israel's border, no shadow deal whispered in closed corridors can rewrite what was spoken under desert stars to a childless old man named Abraham. That covenant was carved into history with a promise that through his line, the world would see redemption. Israel's survival isn't proof of military genius or foreign aid alone. It's proof that God keeps inconvenient promises even when it costs generations to defend them. Iran can fund terror, train militias, and circle Israel with threats. But each attempt to strangle the covenant only proves its power. The same Persia that once liberated Jerusalem now curses it. But that reversal is not the end of the story. Prophecy doesn't tremble under new governments or shifting alliances. It absorbs them, bends them, uses them to remind kings that no throne outlasts the one who sits above them all. But before you nod and scroll on, consider this. What happens in Jerusalem won't stay there. The final clash won't just rearrange borders. It will redraw reality itself. And the same covenant that protects Israel marks you too, if you have the courage to see it. We'll confront that in our last breath together. Wait for it. It's tempting to watch this unfold from a safe distance, scrolling past news of airstrikes, alliances, and threats, telling yourself it's just another distant conflict. But if everything you've heard until now is true, then what rises between Israel and Iran is not just their war. It's a signal that the story is bending toward its final chapter. And you are not a spectator. You're positioned inside that chapter, whether you acknowledge it or not. Scripture doesn't ask us to hoard canned food or hide under bunkers when nations rage. It calls us to stand awake, clear-eyed, and anchored in a truth unshaken by mushroom clouds or headline panic. Psalm 122 says, "Pray for the peace of Jerusalem. May those who love you be secure." Not because prayer is a ritual, but because it aligns us with the author of this storyline, the one whose covenant laughter drowns out every saber rattle in Tehran. Maybe you've felt it, a numbness when you read about these conflicts, as if they belong to another world. But the same spiritual war behind Iran's fury aims to keep you passive, distracted, scrolling away from clarity and urgency. Don't let it win. What happens in the hills of Jerusalem reaches the corners of your living room, shaping not just prophecy, but the posture of your own life. So now ask yourself, are you drifting, or are you ready to stand where this covenant demands courage? If this video shook your perspective even slightly, don't silence it. Carry it forward. Share it with someone lost in the noise. And tonight, before you sleep, speak a prayer that echoes those ancient promises. May peace guard Jerusalem, and may your heart stay awake until the day every war bows to the returning king. This conflict may be unstoppable, but so is the one who wrote its end. You've stayed with this story long enough to know it's not just history repeating itself. It's prophecy, moving one step closer to fulfillment. Wars will rise, alliances will shift, leaders will come and go, but the covenant remains unshaken. That's your anchor when headlines scream chaos. If this opened your eyes, don't keep it to yourself. Share this with someone still asleep to what's unfolding. And if you're ready to stand awake in a world that would rather you drift, drop a comment below. Say, "I stand awake." You're not alone in this hour, and neither is Jerusalem. Watch the signs. Stay clear. Pray boldly. The war may be written, but your response is being written right now.